Elk Ridge was a town rarely spoken of. On maps it was merely a tiny dot, lost somewhere along the New England coastline. Foggy streets, dilapidated houses, and an endless gray sky. Everything about this place seemed frozen in time. But even the quietest places have their secrets, and Elk Ridge was no exception. The locals were reluctant to share their town's history. Over a cup of coffee at the local diner, one might catch fragments of legends, stories about mysterious disappearances, a dreadful curse, or the strange woman who owned the antique shop. These tales were rarely complete, but one stood out for its chilling nature. It was about an old doll, said to have been made from materials imbued with evil. They said that anyone who looked into her hollow eyes felt a peculiar unease, and those brave or foolish enough to hold her would disappear without a trace. Thick fog surrounded Julian's small car as if trying to hide it from the world. The narrow road wound through hills dotted with sparse trees. Elk Ridge grew closer with every mile, and Julian felt a strange pressure building. "What a peculiar place," he muttered as a road sign came into view. Elk Ridge, population 138. They could have at least given it a fresh coat of paint. Julian smirked, noting the faded letters. The road led him to the town's center. Narrow streets, old houses with sagging roofs, and faded signs that were barely legible. Most of the buildings looked abandoned, but occasionally figures moved behind the windows. The people here seemed as reclusive as the town itself. He stopped in front of a hotel, a modest two-story building with peeling paint. A bell jingled softly as he pushed the door open. "Welcome," rumbled the old man behind the counter. His face was deeply wrinkled, and his eyes hid beneath thick eyebrows. "Staying long?" "I'm not sure yet. I'm a writer, looking for interesting places to work." The old man shook his head. "Well, we've got plenty of stories around here. Just don't go poking your nose where it doesn't belong." Julian raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" "You'll find out soon enough," the old man chuckled, handing him the key to his room. The next day, Julian decided to explore the town. The morning was foggy, and the faint sea breeze carried the salty scent of the ocean. Elk Ridge felt even gloomier than it had the day before. The sun struggled to pierce the thick layer of clouds. As he strolled through the streets, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Occasionally, he noticed movement in the windows of the houses, but when he turned, he saw only empty curtains. "This town feels frozen in time," he thought as he approached the central square. His gaze landed on an antique shop with a faded sign, "Winslow's Antiques." The building's facade was cracked, and the windows were coated in dust. Julian felt an inexplicable pull toward the place, as if someone were calling him inside. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the scent of aged wood, dust, and faintly burnt candles greeted him. The bell above the door jingled, prat, and a quiet voice echoed from the back of the shop. "Welcome." The shop was cluttered with various items, old clocks, massive cabinets, dim mirrors. Julian wandered between the shelves, examining the details. But what caught his attention was something in the corner. A doll under a glass dome. She was flawlessly white, as if made of ice. Her chestnut hair was neatly arranged, and her lips curved into a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. But her eyes? She had none. Instead, there were hollow black sockets. Julian felt a strange tension, as if an invisible force were holding his gaze. He took a step closer, barely noticing as his hand reached for the glass dome. "Don't touch her." The sharp voice made him jump. Julian turned to see a woman. She was thin, with sharp features and gray hair tied into a bun. Her piercing gaze sent chills down his spine. "Sorry," Julian said, pulling his hand back. That doll is not for you," she interrupted, her voice firm and almost threatening. "Why not? It's an antique, isn't it?" "It's a curse," she replied softly. Julian squinted, trying to gauge whether she was serious. "Are you saying it's dangerous?" "Yes. Her name is Evelyn." He laughed, though a knot formed in his stomach. "Surely you don't believe in these old superstitions?" "It's not a superstition," she said, clenching her fingers. "Everyone who tried to take her has disappeared." Julian hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity only grew stronger. "Look, I'm a writer. Stories like this are exactly what I need. Sell her to me." Her eyes narrowed. "She'll choose you herself if she thinks you're worthy, but I wouldn't test fate." That night, Julian couldn't sleep. The doll kept resurfacing in his thoughts. He remembered her face, those hollow sockets that seemed to stare straight through him. "It's just a doll," he repeated to himself, lying in bed. But the unease wouldn't leave him. In the middle of the night, he woke with the unsettling feeling that someone was in the room. He opened his eyes and saw that the wardrobe door was slightly ajar. Sitting up, Julian peered into the darkness. He thought he saw movement, but it could have been just a shadow cast by the moonlight. Julian tried to convince himself it was his imagination, but then he saw her. Evelyn. The doll sat on the table. He froze, unable to believe his eyes. "This isn't possible," he whispered, standing slowly. Julian approached cautiously. She sat there with the same faint smile and hollow sockets. Her pose was unnatural, as if she had moved on her own. He searched the entire room, checking the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure, with no signs of anyone entering. "Who brought you here?" he muttered, feeling his heartbeat pounding in his chest. But the doll didn't answer. The next morning, Julian brought her back to the shop. "Take her back," he said to Mrs. Winslow. She merely shook her head. "She has already chosen you." Julian sat on the edge of his bed, staring tensely at the doll. She was back again, her hollow sockets fixed on him as if judging his every move. He wiped the sweat from his brow and picked up his phone, intending to call the police, but hesitated. What would he even say? That a doll was following him? They'd either laugh or think he was insane. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Someone in this town must be playing a prank on me." Deciding to take action, Julian wrapped the doll tightly in cloth and stuffed her into his backpack. This time, he drove far from the town center, heading to an abandoned quarry he had seen on the outskirts. The drive took nearly an hour, but he was determined to end this. By the time he arrived, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the deep pit filled with dark, stagnant water. Julian pulled the doll from his backpack, took one last look at her lifeless face, and tossed her into the quarry. She fell with a hollow splash and disappeared beneath the murky surface. "That's it," he said, wiping his clammy hands on his jeans. As he drove back to the hotel, a strange unease crept over him. The sky turned a dull gray, the wind picked up, and the world around him seemed unnaturally quiet. When he entered his room, his heart nearly stopped. The doll sat on his bed. Her porcelain face now bore new cracks, as if the very material was decaying. But the most terrifying change was in her eyes. They were no longer empty. A faint, smoldering red light now flickered within the sockets, like embers burning in the dark. On the mirror above the table, words were scrawled in what looked like blood. "You cannot get rid of me." The next morning, Julian went to the local library, determined to uncover the truth about the doll. The library was quiet, its shelves coated in dust, and the books looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. The only other person there was an elderly man with old-fashioned glasses, seated at a large wooden desk. This was Mr. Collins, the town historian. "Can I help you?" he asked when Julian approached him. "Yes, I'm looking for information about a doll. Her name is Evelyn." Mr. Collins froze for a moment, then removed his glasses and studied Julian carefully. "Evelyn, you say? Why do you ask?" "She appeared in my room, and I can't seem to get rid of her." The old man's face darkened. He paused, then finally spoke. "You'd best leave that story alone. But if you insist, follow me." He led Julian to a far corner of the library where shelves held faded books with crumbling spines. Pulling one out, he flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. "This," Collins said, pointing to an illustration. The drawing depicted a doll with empty eyes, unmistakably Evelyn. This doll was made by Thomas Gray, a master doll maker in the mid-19th century. He was famous for his exquisite porcelain creations, but he became obsessed with the idea of creating the perfect doll, one that was practically alive. And he succeeded? Yes, but at a terrible cost. Collins turned the page, revealing another sketch. A man surrounded by strange symbols, holding what appeared to be a human heart. Gray lost his wife and daughter under mysterious circumstances. Consumed by grief, he delved into the occult, hoping to bring them back. Evelyn was the result of his efforts. He poured his anguish into the doll, but he used materials that should never have been touched. "What kind of materials?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. "Her eyes?" Collins said grimly. "They aren't just porcelain. They're obsidian, mined from a site where ancient human sacrifices took place. The stones are said to trap the souls of the dead. Gray used them in a ritual to animate the doll, but instead of life, he imbued her with evil." Julian clenched his fists. "So the doll is cursed?" "More than cursed," Collins replied. "She becomes part of those who own her. She feeds on their fears, their energy, and eventually their souls." Julian began noticing changes in himself. His sleep was restless, plagued by nightmares, and he constantly felt drained. Every time he looked at the doll, her hollow eyes seemed to draw him in, pulling at his very thoughts. One morning, he woke to find strange marks on his arm, burn-like impressions, as if small, strong fingers had gripped him during the night. The doll was no longer just a lifeless object. He could see her changing. Her smile grew wider. Her once empty eyes now glowed faintly, and her body seemed to twitch ever so slightly. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard her voice for the first time. "You belong to me, Julian," she whispered, her tone cold and emotionless. Desperate, Julian returned to Mrs. Winslow's shop. She seemed neither surprised nor alarmed to see him. "So she's decided to claim you," Mrs. Winslow said, her gaze fixed on the doll. "You have only one chance left." She told Julian about an ancient ritual that could destroy the doll, but it required rare materials and had to be performed at the quarry, where the obsidian for Evelyn's eyes was said to have been mined. Julian spent 2 days gathering what he needed. Each night the doll grew more aggressive. Her whispers turned to screams, and her movements became more noticeable. At last, he arrived at the quarry. He arranged the materials around him, placing Evelyn at the center of a circle. Her lifeless face reflected the dim light of the candles, cracks spreading across her porcelain skin. He began chanting the incantation Mrs. Winslow had given him. At first, nothing happened. Then the air grew heavy, and the candles extinguished themselves. A low, guttural hum resonated from the depths of the quarry. The doll came to life. Her glowing eyes burned brighter, and Julian felt an invisible force tighten around his throat. "You will never be rid of me," she screamed, her voice echoing in his mind. The ritual failed. Evelyn not only survived, but emerged more powerful than ever. Julian disappeared that night. When authorities searched his hotel room, they found it empty, except for the doll. Her eyes now shone with a brilliant crimson glow, and her cracked lips formed an unnerving, wide grin. Evelyn was returned to Mrs. Winslow's shop, where she resumed her place under the glass dome. The locals began avoiding the shop entirely, and those who dared to enter swore they heard whispers behind them as they left. The final words Julian left behind, scrawled on the mirror in his hotel room, read, "She's looking for her next victim."